From the very day he ascended the throne, Nicholas swore to follow in his father's footsteps. Like him, built an oppressive regime. This, in turn, caused the opposition to grow day by day and drew new elements into its ranks. One of these new elements was the Social Democrats. Many of the Social Democrats were people who had fled to Europe to escape repression and imprisonment during the reign of Alexander III. Among the leaders of the Social Democrats who remained in Russia was Vladimir Lenin. Lenin conducted intensive propaganda among the working class created by Russia's rapidly expanding industry. He began organizing workers around issues such as poor working conditions, some of the lowest wages in Europe, the repression they faced, and the absence of the right to strike or to engage in collective bargaining. During the 1890s, Lenin traveled to major European capitals such as Berlin and Paris, where he met many Marxist and communist ideologues, returning to Russia with numerous illegal publications. Vladimir distributed these materials among workers who were on strike across the country. Together with his revolutionary comrades, he founded the League of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class, which called on workers to strike and rise up through its publications. However, like many revolutionaries, Lenin's activities were closely monitored. In late 1895, while preparing to publish a newspaper titled The Workers' Cause, they were arrested. After spending some time in prison, Lenin was exiled to Siberia. Yet imprisonment and exile did not halt his work. He continued to maintain contacts with revolutionaries both inside and outside Russia, and in 1898, with the participation of Social Democrats from across the empire, the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party was founded. By this point, however, the Tsarist regime would no longer face opposition only from hardened revolutionaries. Well-educated professional groups living in the major cities also began to turn away from the regime. This educated segment wanted for themselves the material prosperity and freedoms enjoyed by their counterparts in Europe and saw the regime as the greatest obstacle to achieving them. Doctors, teachers, academics, engineers, and many other professional groups increasingly drifted into the ranks of the opposition. As the new century approached, the state of Russia's domestic and foreign policy began to ring alarm bells for the regime. From the day he took the throne, Nicholas was forced to contend with dozens of problems. Yet one of these problems, perhaps the greatest, was his cousin. Kaiser Wilhelm would become one of Nicholas's most serious tests. Alexander III had deeply disliked Wilhelm. The mutual distrust between the two had given rise to the Russo-French alliance. The alliance that Bismarck had spent decades trying to prevent had come into being within just a few years as a result of Wilhelm's policies. Like Bismarck before him, Wilhelm began to fear the nightmare of a two-front war and, to prevent such a possibility, tried to pry Russia away from France. Wilhelm, however, made a grave mistake. He transformed what should have been a diplomatic process into a militarized one filled with veiled threats. In particular, he sought to ease pressure on Germany by keeping Russia away from France and continental Europe. To this end, he constantly sent telegrams to Nicholas, warning him of potential threats involving various countries.
God knows I have done everything in my power to preserve peace in Europe. But France is being secretly encouraged even in these peaceful days. If the French continue to violate all the rules of international friendship and peace, one day, dear Nicky, you will inevitably find yourself in the most terrible war Europe has ever seen.
Bound by family ties, the fate of the two rulers was also intertwined. If Russia began to pursue its interests in Europe or the Balkans, tensions would rise, and Germany's position would become far more difficult. For this reason, the Kaiser also sought to divert the Tsar's attention to other regions. Foremost among these was the Far East. During the 1890s, Germany's policy of supporting Austria-Hungary in the Balkans dealt a heavy blow to Russian ambitions in that region. As a result, Russia began searching for a new sphere of interest. The Far East appeared the most suitable. Under a policy shaped by Sergei Witte, Russia now began to assert itself in the Far East. Yet the region was already a battleground of imperial competition among the European powers. Russia's involvement in an area where British influence was particularly strong intensified the rivalry. Russia chose Manchuria as its primary target. In 1894, a war broke out between China and Japan over control of Korea, further inflaming the competition. In the short conflict, Japan, reaping the rewards of its reforms, defeated China, and the Treaty of Shimonoseki was signed. Through this treaty, Japan extended its reach toward Manchurian territories coveted by Russia. Japan's settlement in southern Manchuria, on the Liaodong Peninsula, was the most undesirable outcome for Russia, as it meant that Manchuria was on the verge of falling under Japanese control. In the aftermath of the war, China entered a period of fragmentation, and the Chinese pie was effectively divided among the European powers. Closely engaged with China in pursuit of its regional goals, Russia sought to secure its share. Under the terms of the Treaty of Shimonoseki, China was required to pay 400 million francs as the first installment of reparations. Unable to meet this obligation due to its dire financial state, China turned to Russia for help. In exchange for a loan of 400 million francs from Russian and French banks, China granted Russia major concessions. According to the agreement between the two sides, the Trans-Siberian Railway under construction would pass through Manchuria. With the railway concession granted to a company established as the Chinese Eastern Railway, Russia would also gain access to the mineral resources along the route. Moreover, the security of the railway corridor would be provided by Russian police. In effect, elements of the Russian army were now setting foot in the Far East. With another agreement signed in 1898, Russia also leased Port Arthur from China and began to establish a permanent presence in the region. This complex situation created a new arena of conflict, and the British began supporting Japan against the perceived Russian threat. France, however, complicated matters further by backing its newly allied partner, Russia, in the Far East. Germany also supported Russia's Far Eastern policy, hoping that Russia would become entangled there, drift away from European affairs, and thereby ease Germany's strategic burden. Seeing that France and Germany were also backing Russia, Japan chose not to risk war against three powers at once and agreed to withdraw from the Liaodong Peninsula. Nevertheless, this episode laid the groundwork for the Russo-Japanese conflict that would soon follow. Japan's superiority over China in the war also sparked reactions within China itself. Chinese intellectuals came to believe that their country's salvation from colonization lay in modernization along European lines, much like Japan's path. Under pressure from these intellectuals, the Chinese emperor initiated a series of reforms. The life of these reforms, however, was short-lived. Conservative elements opposed to modernization rose up against them. This counter-revolutionary movement gradually turned into outright hostility toward foreigners. The leading force behind this anti-foreign movement in China was an organization called Yiho Chuan, meaning righteous fists. European powers would come to call them the Boxers. By early 1900, the insurgent movement began killing Europeans, who were seen as the concrete representatives of colonialism within the country. The uprising grew day by day and became increasingly unmanageable. In response, the European powers formed a multinational force and moved to suppress the rebellion. The Eight-Nation Alliance, formed through Wilhelm's initiatives, consisted of Britain, Germany, Russia, Japan, France, the United States, Italy, and Austria-Hungary. These 8 powers, so to speak, steamrolled the backward Chinese state and moved on. Russia, taking advantage of the situation, began occupying Manchuria, using attacks on newly built railways as justification. While each day another Chinese city fell into the hands of the Eight-Nation Alliance, Russia steadily consolidated its control over Manchuria. After the Boxer movement was suppressed, Russian troops withdrew from Beijing, but not from Manchuria. Russia's operation in Manchuria had a deeply negative impact on Japan. The Japanese now found themselves facing rapidly expanding new neighbor right on their doorstep. Russia had taken the Liaodong Peninsula, established a naval base at Port Arthur, and on top of that had begun occupying all of Manchuria under various pretexts. From the day Japan was forced to withdraw from Liaodong, it began preparing for war against Russia. Military preparations alone were not enough. Political preparations were also necessary. In this context, Japan and Britain sat down at the negotiating table. The Anglo-Japanese alliance, signed in 1902, was announced to the world. The reason for this announcement was clear. Both states wanted Russia to see the agreement and act cautiously. If either of the two were attacked, the other would immediately enter the war. Russia's response was equally clear. With its new ally France, it added a Far Eastern declaration to their European agreements. In the event of any attack, the two states would consult one another. Still feeling insecure, Russia sought to bring Germany, one of the powers that had encouraged it to step into this quagmire, onto its side. However, Kaiser Wilhelm's true aim was to entangle Russia in trouble in the Far East. In a telegram he sent to Nicholas during the early days of his reign, Wilhelm wrote,
"No one can hinder your activities in the Far East. This is undoubtedly Russia's highest mission in the future, to develop the Asian continent and to protect Europe from the invasions of the crowded yellow race."
Despite these words, Wilhelm refused to enter into an alliance. Within the Russian government, statesmen were divided into two camps over Far Eastern policy. On one side were figures such as Finance Minister Sergei Witte and Foreign Minister Vladimir Lambsdorff, who urged the Tsar to act cautiously toward Japan and to avoid tensions that could lead to war. Even the Minister of War, Alexei Kuropatkin, who supported expansionist ambitions in the Far East, believed that a war with Japan should be avoided. Opposing them was a clique led by a businessman named Alexander Bezobrazov. The Manchurian question had already strained relations between the two countries, but for Japan the truly critical issue was Korea. If Russia refrained from making a move in Korea, the crisis could have been resolved at the negotiating table. However, under Bezobrazov's influence, and despite opposition from the Witte faction, the Tsar decided to act. In the Amur region near the Korea-Manchuria border, timber exploitation rights were granted to a private company, the East Asia Company, funded by the Tsar and managed by Bezobrazov. Bezobrazov and his associates convinced the Tsar that just as the East India Company had served Britain in India, the East Asia Company could serve Russia in Korea and China. Sergei Witte continued to warn the Tsar at every opportunity. With peasant uprisings, protests, and major strikes ongoing at home, pursuing an aggressive Far Eastern policy was, in Witte's view, a catastrophic mistake. However, the Minister of the Interior, Vyacheslav von Plehve, supported the aggressive line. Russia was built not by diplomacy, but by bayonets, he declared. In his view, The time for pens had passed. It was time for weapons. In this clash of ideas, Witte was forced to resign from his post as Minister of Finance in 1903, becoming the loser of the struggle. But the real loser was Russia itself, although at the time, no one yet realized it. The fact that Nicholas trusted most was Russia's status as a European power. He could not imagine that an Asian country would dare to declare war on a vast European empire. For this reason, no concessions could be made to Japan. If war came, Russia would do what was necessary, at least. That was how the Tsar saw it. Port Arthur, seized as the result of Russia's long-standing desire for an ice-free port, would soon drag Russia into the fires of hell. The evening of the 8th of February, 1904, it unfolded like any other. Tsar Nicholas was watching the opera at the Mariinsky Theatre. At Port Arthur, the situation seemed no different. The weather was cold and clear, and officers were chatting on the decks of their ships. Suddenly, a loud noise startled them. About half a kilometer away, the battleship Rättvisa, whose name means justice in Swedish, had suffered an explosion. Its torpedoes had recently undergone repairs, and most assumed it was an accident. At the time of the explosion, Russian Admiral Oskar Stark was hosting a birthday party for his wife on the deck of the flagship Petropavlovsk. The officers at the party mistook the sound for fireworks, but the real party was just beginning. The Japanese fleet, commanded by Togo Heihachiro, launched its second and third torpedoes. Within minutes, the ships Payada and Zezarevich were rendered inoperable. The Japanese had carried out a devastating surprise attack on Port Arthur, seriously damaging the most important ships of the Russian fleet. After the performance ended, Nicholas received a telegram. Around midnight, Japanese torpedo boats launched a sudden attack against our fleet at Port Arthur, Chief of Staff Alexiev. The two states were now officially at war. The following day, the Tsar and the imperial family prayed for victory in the chapel of the Winter Palace. Statesmen delivered fiery speeches, confidently predicting success. The public, however, did not share this enthusiasm. When newspapers published the headline "We are at war," there was almost no public reaction. The Russian people could not understand why this war was being fought, nor did they internalize the struggle. The regime's hope for an outpouring of popular support was dashed. Russia entered the war far from the atmosphere of enthusiasm it had hoped to create. What followed would not help Russia at all. The Trans-Siberian Railway was still incomplete. To keep supply lines functioning, the enemy needed to be delayed. Yet even within the high command, things were going badly. General Alexei Kuropatkin, commander of the Russian Imperial Army in the Far East, favored a strategy of delay. In contrast, the Far Eastern governor, Evgeny Alexiev, constantly pushed for a more aggressive approach. The two men clashed repeatedly. In this tense environment, the first major land battle between the two powers took place in April-May 1904. The Yalu River, which played a key role in Manchuria, was to be held by 25,000 Russian troops. Defeat there would pose a serious threat to Russia's far eastern territories. Indeed, taking advantage of their numerical superiority and geographic proximity, the Japanese inflicted a crushing defeat. With a force of over 40,000 men, the Imperial Japanese Army launched its main offensive on the 27th of April, routing the Russians. By the 1st of May, the remaining Russian units were forced into a chaotic retreat. The consequences of the battle were as much psychological as they were military. For centuries, no Asian power had defeated a European one. This battle was a historic turning point. The Russians, who had expected an easy victory in the Far East, were left in shock. For Russia, the war unfolded as a colossal fiasco. After the Battle of the Yalu River, Japanese forces advanced into Manchuria and placed Port Arthur under full siege. Port Arthur had become a matter of imperial honor for Russia. Holding the port seemed like the central objective of the war. However, Japan had achieved overwhelming superiority both at sea and on land. Russian armies, separated from their capital by thousands of kilometers, depended entirely on reinforcements arriving via the Trans-Siberian Railway. Yet the railway had been built as a single track. Sergei Witte had warned the Tsar about the necessity of a double track, but his advice was ignored. Even the slightest Japanese attack on the railway disrupted the entire supply system. In October, Kuropatkin launched a counter-offensive to relieve Port Arthur. In the battle known as the Battle of Shaho, the Russian army failed to drive the Japanese out of northern Manchuria. The region continued to fall into Japanese hands, while the siege of Port Arthur tightened. The Tsar then made a fateful decision to rescue besieged Port Arthur. The Russian Far Eastern Fleet had been almost completely destroyed. Desperate to reinforce the navy and restore imperial honor, Nicholas played his last major card and ordered the Baltic Fleet to sail to the region. This decision, however, would only add another catastrophe to the list. A fleet of nearly 50 ships departed from the Baltic Sea, embarking on a journey of almost 30,000 kilometers. Sailing around Africa, the crews endured countless hardships. By the time they reached their destination, they were exhausted and worn down. Meanwhile, the Japanese intensified their attacks on Port Arthur. Unable to withstand the pressure of the siege, the garrison surrendered to the Japanese on the 2nd of January 1905. For the Baltic Fleet, only one objective remained: to reach the Russian port of Vladivostok. Attempting to slip through the Tsushima Strait under cover of darkness, the Russian fleet was spotted at around 3 a.m. by the Japanese armed merchant ship Shinano Maru. Admiral Togo, commander of the Japanese combined fleet, mobilized immediately. On the 27th of May, around midday, the two fleets sighted one another. But what followed was not a battle in the usual sense. For Russia, what happened on the 27th of May was not a battle but a catastrophe. The Japanese Navy lost 3 torpedo boats, with around 100 men killed and 500 wounded. The situation for the Russian fleet was entirely different. 5,000 sailors were killed, 800 wounded, 6,000 captured, 6 major warships sunk, and out of more than 40 ships, only 3 survived. The Baltic Fleet was, for all intents and purposes, annihilated. Apart from the destroyers Almaz, Grozny, and Bravey, the entire fleet was lost. Yet the Japanese war was far from the Tsar's worst nightmare. While the Tsarist regime sought adventure in the Far East in search of an ice-free port, St. Petersburg was about to be engulfed in flames. While Nicholas looked east for victory, he failed to see the revolution drawing ever closer. For the Tsar, the bells of danger would ring not in Asia, but in his own capital.